One evening in March of 1974, an investigator in Salt Lake City, Utah, sat across an interrogation table from a man who claimed he had psychic powers. Now, the investigator had naturally been quite skeptical of this man and his powers, but the man began giving him a bunch of very specific visions about the case the investigator was trying to solve. And in fact, some of the information he was revealing was enough to make the investigator wonder, could this man actually be a psychic? Or was he the killer? But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times a week. So if that's of interest to you, please go on an amazing vacation with the like button and volunteer to take pictures for them. But every time you take their picture, turn the camera around secretly and just take selfies of yourself. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On March 11th, 1974, 22-year-old Barbara Rockey sat at a desk in her bedroom in Provo, Utah, writing furiously. And as she was writing, eventually she paused for a minute to reread what she had written, but she wasn't quite happy yet, so she added a few more lines. The letter she was writing was for her roommates, and she knew it had to be perfect, because Barbara was saying goodbye. So Barbara was a junior at Brigham Young University, or BYU, which was a very religious school where most students were practicing Mormons, but not Barbara. She had chosen to go to BYU because of religion, but really just because she was fascinated by it, and thought going to a school structured around faith would be very interesting. But when she actually got there, she immediately felt out of place, because her classmates went to church every week for hours at a time, and they all followed a pretty strict set of behavioral rules and values, which wasn't really Barbara's thing. Barbara was from California and considered herself more of a free spirit who liked exploring new ideas and trying new things. So over the last 3 years, Barbara had felt both frustrated and also alienated by the other students' very rigid lifestyles. She'd been hoping that that would change with her new living situation. She'd just moved in with 7 other girls in January. But now, just 2 months into that, it was already very obvious that those girls did not like her. They were just as religious as the rest of the kids at BYU, and they seemed to think Barbara was weird for doing things like dating around and experimenting with different religions. It just didn't make sense to them. So Barbara had decided that instead of trying to change her roommates' minds, she would just lean into this kind of weird behavior, as they called it. Barbara basically started making them uncomfortable on purpose, like by saying she prayed to the devil, which totally shocked them. And after a while, Barbara had really got the sense that these girls, they weren't just weirded out by her, they were now actively scared of her, which really alienated Barbara a whole lot more. And so all of that was why Barbara was now writing this letter. She was telling her roommates that she was just going to go ahead and leave campus for a while to be with people that actually understood her. And the people she was thinking of were people like Richard Finder, a self-proclaimed psychic that Barbara had connected with after she had called into a radio show where Richard had been giving psychic readings. And the two of them had connected immediately, because even though Richard was almost a decade older than her, he understood Barbara in a way that no one else in her life did. And ever since, they'd had this really intense relationship that felt both romantic and spiritual at the same time. But since Richard lived far away, most of their relationship so far had been over the phone. And so Barbara thought it might be nice to be physically closer to Richard and also his circle of friends. But there was another reason Barbara wanted to get away from BYU. And that was because she had started to feel unsafe being a young woman on a college campus. So recently there had been some scary national news stories about college women being attacked on campus. One student in Washington State had been beaten and almost killed in her dorm room in January, and another woman had gone missing the following month. And even though these attacks had not literally happened at BYU, it still freaked Barbara out. I mean, especially because these women who had been targeted just looked a lot like her physically, with long dark hair and sort of similar features. And so as a precaution, Barbara had been taking judo classes at school, and even got her best friend, Jerry Hicker, to help her buy a gun. Except Barbara had actually lost her gun recently. She'd not been able to find it for the last few weeks. She'd reported it missing to the campus police, but she really had no idea where it went. But for now, Barbara forgot about the gun and just took a deep breath and finished up her goodbye letter. Then she glanced over at the clock and saw it was almost 10 a.m., and so she had to get to class. So she grabbed the letter and put it inside of her purse, where she also was holding a turquoise necklace, which she planned to sell that day. It was the single most valuable thing that she owned, and she was going to pawn it to get some seed money to leave town. She'd figure out her actual destination based on how much she got for it. As Barbara threw her bag over her shoulder and got ready to leave, she heard a car pull into the driveway outside, which was a relief because she'd actually let her best friend Jerry borrow her car to go skiing the other day, and she had been hoping he would drop it off before she left for class, and so clearly that's what he was doing. And so Barbara hurried out her front door, and sure enough, there was her car, and there was Jerry climbing out and waving her keys, basically being like, "Hey, I'm back." As Jerry handed the car keys back over to Barbara, he asked her if they were still on for hanging out later. But Barbara was busy thinking about getting to class and the logistics of selling her necklace. She had decided that Salt Lake City would have more pawn shops that would pay better, and it was also less than an hour north. And so now that Jerry had dropped her car off, she could drive up there right after class. And so, Barbara just kind of nodded at Jerry and whatever he was saying, and then she took the keys, jumped in her car, and she was off. Over an hour later, Barbara was sitting in her social work class waiting for the teacher to dismiss them. And as she was sitting there, she began to hear some students whispering behind her. And as they did, even though she couldn't quite hear what they were saying, she began to feel her face get red. Because even though she didn't know if they were talking about her, if they were, it certainly would not be the first time. People talked about her a lot. So Barbara just did her best to try to ignore them. And then as soon as the teacher said they could go, she jumped up and shoved her books into her bag. And then she hurried out of the building to where her car was parked. She got in and pulled out of the lot. And as she made her way down the street, she actually felt a wave of excitement. She couldn't wait to sell this necklace and finally get out of this place. About 3 hours later, Barbara's best friend Jerry walked up the sidewalk to Barbara's house. He thought they had plans to meet up that afternoon, but Barbara never showed. And Barbara did not usually just blow off plans without calling, so now he was actually at her house just to make sure she was okay. And now Jerry noticed that her car was not in her driveway. So he just stood there for a minute, wondering if maybe he should go in and ask her roommates where she was. But he ultimately decided against it and just instead headed back to his place. But after beginning the walk back to his place, he passed by an apartment complex down the street from Barbara's place, and he stopped because he could clearly see Barbara's car parked in the lot, which was definitely out of the ordinary, because Jerry was sure she did not know anybody who lived there. And so now, really starting to worry about Barbara, Jerry walked up to her car to check it out, and when he looked inside, he saw there was a note. And so he just opened up her car because he found it was unlocked, and he grabbed the note and he began to read it. And as he did, he felt his heart rate start to pick up. An hour later, Jerry ran into the campus police station with Barbara's roommates following right behind him. After finding the note inside of Barbara's car, Jerry had gone back to Barbara's house to show it to her roommates and ask if they had seen her, because now he was worried that this note was some kind of suicide note. The note was a goodbye letter that Barbara apparently had written, and it said that she was leaving to be with her people, and the tone of it was just kind of alarming. Now, Jerry could tell her roommates thought that he was overreacting to this note, but they had ultimately agreed to come with him to the police to just make sure everything was okay. And so as soon as the officer on duty came out, Jerry explained to him that he had had plans with Barbara that day and she had not shown up, which was very uncharacteristic. And then he explained how he found her car and then also this letter and his concerns about this letter. And the officer on duty said, okay, we'll look into it. And so over the next few hours, the campus police did look into it. They reached out to some other kids on campus and also to Barbara's family, but nobody had seen or heard from Barbara since that morning. And so the police continued to look into this, realizing this could be a missing persons case, but technically not enough time had passed to officially call it that. So in this first day, it was all just kind of preliminary. The next day, almost 50 miles north of the BYU campus, a worker for a Utah utility company hiked up a trail in Big Cottonwood Canyon, a hilly nature preserve on the outskirts of Salt Lake City. Officially, he was there to check on some water lines. But he was also, taking his time and enjoying himself. I mean, this area was beautiful. It was high up in the mountains and very remote and peaceful. So this guy was genuinely shocked when he reached the top of the trail and saw he was not alone. There was a woman up there, But at first, the way his brain processed what he was seeing is he saw this woman who was lying on the ground and she appeared to be nude or partially nude, and he thought, oh, she's sunbathing, like that's what she's doing up here. But then he's like, it's March, it's cold, and she's face down, and she's definitely totally naked. And then he took a few more steps forward, and his brain kind of processed what he was seeing, at which point he just gasped, turned around, and ran back to his car to go alert the police. Within the hour, Captain Pete Hayward with the Salt Lake City Sheriff's Office drove his cruiser along a remote access road that led to Big Cottonwood Canyon. So Hayward normally loved being in nature. All he really did in his spare time was hunt and fish. But right now, the scenery and remote location were actually kind of an inconvenience, because he needed to get to his destination quickly, and that was just very hard to do out here. Hayward had just gotten a call about a woman who had been found dead in the canyon by a worker for a utility company. And while a few responders were actually already there securing the scene, Hayward knew they wouldn't be able to really do anything until he got there. Because when he worked a murder case, every single detail had to go through him. A few minutes later, Hayward saw some police cars up ahead on the side of the road, and also a deputy waiting by a trailhead. And so he pulled over, got out, and then followed the deputy up a steep trail for about 300 yards. And he was pretty out of breath by the time he saw a few other crime scene techs and officers gathered around a bush, where underneath the bush there was a body of a naked woman lying face down on the ground. Hayward walked over and crouched down to examine the body. And right away he could see at least 3 bullet wounds in the woman's back. But other than that, he didn't see any other injuries, and there were no clear signs of decomposition. His best guess was that this woman had been there for maybe a day or so, which was actually sort of a miracle when he thought about it. I mean, this time of year, nobody came out to this area, and if it hadn't been for that utility worker, I mean, she might not have been found for months. Hayward looked next to the body, and he saw the woman's clothes and shoes were right nearby, and each item was actually folded very neatly, which struck him as a little bit strange. Hayward pulled on a glove and began examining the clothing, and he could see that there was really nothing ripped or damaged. And also, as Hayward kind of walked around the immediate area, he noticed the whole scene was just as neat as the clothes. There was no gun anywhere, and no marks in the dirt or signs of a struggle or a fight, and there was no indication that the body had been dragged around, and so Hayward felt pretty confident that this woman was likely shot and killed in the exact spot she was found in. Hayward stood in the middle of the trail and considered everything he was seeing. The neatly folded clothes could have been removed during consensual sex, and then maybe things turned violent, or they could mean the woman was maybe forced to undress at gunpoint. Either way, Hayward's gut told him that this woman's killer was someone she knew, because the thing was, getting up here from the road was not easy. I mean, Hayward was pushing 50 and knew he was not in the best shape, but even for somebody who was young and fit, it would be hard to force another person all the way up a trail like this. It made more sense that this woman had first walked up willingly with someone she likely trusted, and then that person killed her once they were up there. But Hayward knew, his theory didn't mean much until he figured out who this woman was. She didn't seem to have a purse with her, and there was no ID in the pockets of her folded clothes. So Hayward waved some other officers over to help him flip her body over so they could look underneath her. And when they did that, Hayward saw there were a few bullets gathered in the dirt. They'd clearly gone straight through this woman from the shots in her back. And so Hayward quickly told a tech to go ahead and photograph and bag the bullets for testing, and also to get some of the dirt that the bullets had been lodged in case there was some other evidence mixed in. So investigators in the 1970s did not rely on DNA yet, but they could test for things like clothing fibers or hairs and potentially connect that material to suspects. And so after giving his team their marching orders, Hayward took a deep breath and then headed back down the trail. He needed to go find this woman's name. The next day, Wednesday, March 13th, Hayward hustled down a hallway towards a meeting room at the Salt Lake City Sheriff's Office. He was bleary-eyed and basically running on adrenaline because he'd been working this case non-stop since the day before. And he'd just come from a meeting with the ballistics expert who told him the gun that killed this woman was likely a .357 caliber. Now, this was obviously great for the investigation. However, a .357 was not particularly uncommon, so it didn't really narrow things down a whole bunch. However, Hayward had uncovered something that was major for the investigation, and that was the victim's identity. It was 22-year-old Barbara Rockey. So Hayward's team had put a broadcast out over the news the night before about the discovery of this body. And after they had put that out, they had gotten a call from the BYU police about a student of theirs who had gone missing a day earlier. And just a few hours ago, some of this missing student's classmates had come up to Salt Lake City to identify the body, and they had confirmed it was Barbara. Now, Hayward had spoken to some of those kids already, and he had some other officers contacting Barbara's family. But right now, Hayward was on his way to get a formal statement from a young man named Jerry Hicker. Jerry was one of the people who identified the body, and he was the first person to report Barbara missing. So Hayward was hoping he would have information that could point them towards Barbara's killer. Minutes later, Hayward sat down at a conference table across from Jerry, and from the looks of it, Jerry was very rattled. He kept shaking his head and looking away like he was trying not to cry, but Hayward was not a particularly gentle interviewer, so he didn't waste time with condolences or tissues, especially because Jerry was an obvious suspect. He was Barbara's closest friend at school, apparently, and Hayward was sure Barbara was killed by somebody she trusted. So he just bluntly told Jerry that he needed to know every single thing that happened on the day Barbara went missing. Jerry was sort of caught off guard by this level of bluntness, but he took a shaky breath and then explained how he'd borrowed Barbara's car the day before and then dropped it back off at her place on Monday morning around 10 a.m. And then he went to the library for a few hours. He then said he was supposed to meet up with Barbara. They had plans for later that day to hang out, but Barbara didn't show up. And when he went to her house to check on her car was gone. And so he began walking back home again when he actually saw her car down the block outside of an apartment complex that he didn't understand she would be at. Like, he didn't think she knew anybody who lived over there. And he said he walked up to the car, looked inside, and saw there was a note. He tried the door handle, it was open, he reached inside, got the note out, and he read it, and he said it was a pretty disturbing note. He thought it was maybe a suicide note. Hayward nodded. He had seen the note. The BYU police had given it to him. It did seem to be from Barbara, telling her roommates she was leaving town to be with people who she fit in with, but the note was kind of vague, and Hayward really wasn't sure what to make of it just yet. It could be a suicide note, or it could be something entirely ordinary. And the truth was, he wasn't actually even sure that Barbara had really written the letter. Maybe her killer had written the letter. Maybe whoever murdered Barbara was attempting to make her disappearance look like a suicide, or maybe imply that she had run away in the hopes that police would never find her body. And so Hayward had sent the letter off to a handwriting expert to see what they thought. Now, Hayward asked Jerry about his relationship with Barbara, and Jerry explained that the two of them hung out a ton, and she had gravitated towards him since she felt sort of unwelcome at school and around her roommates, who didn't really like her because she wasn't religious like they were. Jerry also told Hayward that Barbara had made the conflict with her roommates much worse by intentionally saying sacrilegious things in order to freak them out. So he said there was a lot of tension between them, and it had gotten so bad that at one point he had tried to find Barbara another place to live. This made Hayward perk up. Knowing that Barbara had a potential domestic conflict was an interesting lead. Even though a group of young, devout Mormon women were not necessarily obvious murder suspects, it was definitely worth looking into. Maybe one of them had been so horrified and outraged by Barbara's teasing that they'd snapped and tried to hurt her. Hayward didn't have any other questions for Jerry, so he stood up and told him he could go. He wasn't ready to eliminate anybody as a suspect just yet, but so far, Jerry seemed pretty unlikely. He had an alibi, and he was also the one who reported Barbara missing. And considering it was complete luck that her body was even found at all in the area that it was, it really would have been in the killer's best interest to keep quiet and hope her body was never found. So why would Jerry go to police at all if he was the killer? So Hayward headed out the door to wrangle some officers. They needed to go to Provo and have another word with Barbara's roommates. The next afternoon, just 2 days after Barbara was found in the canyon, Hayward pulled up to a pawn shop on the outskirts of Salt Lake City. If he thought he was tired yesterday, well, he was absolutely exhausted now, because a lot had happened in the last 24 hours. They'd gotten in touch with Barbara's family, who were obviously shocked and devastated, but they didn't have any useful information for the investigation. They didn't know much about Barbara's friends or life at school, so they couldn't say if anybody would have wanted to hurt her. And they'd had no idea if she had been planning to leave campus for any reason. But apparently, she was, because the handwriting expert had come back and confirmed the note was authentic, and Barbara did write it. So her plans to leave appeared to be genuine, which is what the note basically was about, if you read it literally. But for Hayward, after speaking to Jerry, who talked about the tension between Barbara and her roommates and how she didn't fit in, and also after Hayward literally spoke to all 7 of Barbara's roommates, and they all actually admitted they did not like Barbara, it made Hayward think that the letter from Barbara should be interpreted literally, that she was just trying to flee campus and get away, in particular from her roommates. But the roommates all had solid alibis for the day Barbara went missing. So for now, Hayward basically had to rule out the roommates. But Hayward was not that upset about this, because the roommates had actually given him another lead. According to one of the roommates, right before Barbara had disappeared, she had mentioned that she planned to pawn a turquoise necklace that she owned in Salt Lake City. So Hayward and some other officers had spent the whole day canvassing pawn shops in that area to see if maybe she had actually gone through with it. Now, so far, Hayward had not found the necklace or, found the pawn shop that maybe Barbara went to, but he was very hopeful, maybe too hopeful in some ways. Because, aside from this necklace lead, the investigation really was kind of losing steam. They had searched and fingerprinted Barbara's car, but had not found anything significant. They'd also gotten the autopsy back, and it was mostly unhelpful. The medical examiner had actually counted 5 gunshot wounds, not just 3, so more than Hayward had thought, but they couldn't confirm whether or not Barbara was sexually assaulted. And also, the forensics report had come back, and they had not been able to collect any fingerprints at the scene. And so all of this was swirling around in Hayward's head as he stepped into this particular pawn shop, and he asked the woman behind the counter if they had recently purchased a turquoise necklace. And to his shock, the woman said yes. And then she gestured towards a glass case behind the counter where Hayward could see a long white necklace lined with turquoise stones on a red felt pad. About a half an hour later, Hayward was back behind the wheel of his cruiser, and his heart was pounding and his mind was racing so fast he could barely pay attention to the road, because Hayward finally had a real trail here. The shop clerk's description of the person who had sold that turquoise necklace matched Barbara perfectly. Not only that, the shopkeeper also had a receipt for the sale that showed Barbara was at the store on March 11th at 12:50 p.m., the same day she went missing. But the most incredible part of this new lead was that Barbara had apparently told this clerk that she was in a hurry, because her boyfriend was circling the block outside. And this was huge because Hayward and his team had spoken to a lot of people in Barbara's life, and no one had mentioned a boyfriend. Now, unfortunately, the pawn shop worker had not gotten a look at this person, this boyfriend that Barbara was talking about. So Hayward had just taken the necklace and the receipt for evidence, and now he was rushing back to the precinct to make some calls. He needed to see if anybody in Barbara's life knew about this boyfriend and maybe had just failed to mention it for some reason. But as soon as Hayward parked and hurried inside the precinct, he was stopped by a deputy, and this deputy seemed as excited and frazzled as Hayward felt. The deputy told Hayward that he wasn't going to believe this, but they had been continuing their background interviews, and some of Barbara's friends said that Barbara had mentioned a boyfriend named Richard. This was great news for Hayward. I mean, he was literally looking for exactly this information. But this actually was not the reason why the deputy was so worked up, just the fact that she had a boyfriend. He explained that Richard was Richard Finder, a supposed psychic from California who just happened to be in town on a ski vacation at the same time Barbara was killed. And the reason they knew that was because Richard had just called the station completely out of the blue and offered to help. A few hours later, Hayward sat down across an interrogation table from 30-year-old Richard Finder. Richard had on glasses and he had a goatee, and he seemed very confident and also quite eager to help. But to Hayward, he just felt like he was putting on an act. He felt certain that Richard had to be Barbara's killer, After all, it actually was not unusual for murderers to actually insert themselves into the murder investigation to sort of, see what's going on and maybe deflect blame away from themselves. And so for Hayward, he felt like that was exactly what Richard was doing, calling in to offer up his supposed psychic services. But also, Hayward had spent the last couple of hours digging into Richard, and he also discovered that he owned a .357 pistol, the same kind of gun that had killed Barbara. And on top of that, he found out the place where Richard was staying was in Salt Lake City, very close to Big Cottonwood Canyon, where Barbara's body was found. It was just too many coincidences, and so Hayward was prepared to get extremely tough with Richard to get a confession. But Hayward got a few of his background questions out of the way first. And after asking Richard how he knew Barbara, Richard explained that they had connected after she had heard him speak on the radio. And he said that they'd actually never been physical, but they'd had a deep spiritual relationship. After that, Hayward cut to the chase and just asked Richard point blank why he had called the station. And at that point, Richard became very serious and said that he needed to come forward because he had a feeling about what had happened to Barbara. He said, he was a psychic, and he had a vision that the gun, the murder weapon, had been thrown in some water somewhere. Hayward couldn't believe what he was hearing, because, the police had not announced the murder weapon was missing. Richard shouldn't have known they were looking for the murder weapon, but clearly he did. So at this point, Hayward did not ask more questions about what his vision said. Instead, he demanded that Richard account for every single hour of his day on Monday, March 11th, the day that Barbara went missing. And for the first time, Richard actually seemed genuinely thrown off. He just sort of stared back at Hayward in what seemed to be complete shock. And then he said he didn't kill Barbara. He said he couldn't have. He was with his friends the whole day. Hayward just kind of glared at Richard and then slid a pad of paper over to him to write down his friend's information so they could follow up. And as he watched Richard hurry to jot down some names and numbers, Hayward felt sure this was their guy. There was just a mountain of circumstantial evidence here against him. But he knew they needed something more concrete to actually make an arrest. So Hayward first would have to check out Richard's alibi, and then also test Richard's personal gun, his .357, against the bullets that had killed Barbara. So he told Richard that for now he could go, but they would need to take a look at his gun. A few weeks later, Hayward sat at his desk in the sheriff's office staring at some ballistics results from Richard's gun. And it would turn out it was definitely not the gun that killed Barbara. And Hayward literally couldn't remember a time when he'd been more, frankly, shocked and disappointed. I mean, he really had Richard pegged as the killer. Richard basically was his only suspect, and he was a great one, especially since they had checked on his alibi and it didn't really hold up. The friends he said he was with that whole day actually said, well, we were with him, but not the whole day. So basically, there were large chunks of time on the day she went missing when Richard was unaccounted for. Hayward sighed and reminded himself that, just because the gun he owned wasn't a match, it didn't mean Richard was innocent. I mean, it's possible he used a different .357 and then just ditched the weapon. Still though, Hayward couldn't believe they were back to square one like this. He felt like he had done everything he could at this point. He talked to who he needed to talk to, he'd analyzed the evidence they'd gotten, and he had really nothing to show for it. Hayward was used to closing cases and giving families the answers they wanted, and now he was worried he was not going to be able to do that. And sure enough, over the coming months and then years, Hayward did continue to investigate this case, but the leads got fewer and fewer, and then eventually he got promoted, and then before long he was pulled into other cases, and eventually Barbara's case just went cold. In the fall of 2005, so over 25 years after Barbara's murder, Detective Todd Park sat on the floor by his desk in the Salt Lake City Sheriff's Department. Around him on the floor, it was covered with crime scene photos and interviews and evidence logs from the 1974 investigation of Barbara Rocky's murder. Park was a brand new homicide detective, and he had taken on this case after getting a call from one of Barbara's sisters, begging the sheriff's office to reopen it. And Park wasn't sure if it was maybe just new guy enthusiasm, but he was already pretty obsessed with trying to solve it. He really wanted to find some answers for the Rocky family, since they'd been wondering what happened to Barbara for now over 2 decades. And Park actually felt pretty optimistic about it. Because even though during the original investigation, they hadn't relied on DNA testing, they couldn't really even do DNA testing. Despite that, the investigators at the time had done a rape kit and saved all the evidence from the scene, like Barbara's clothes and even the dirt that was underneath her body, which meant that with the current advancements in DNA technology, there was a good chance they could actually solve this thing. Park had already sent a few items over for testing, but while he waited for the results, he was going over the details of the case to get a sense of how it was investigated back in 1974. And he found it was a pretty unusual case. The murder had initially been investigated as a personally motivated crime. But while the case was cold, police had also begun to consider the idea that maybe Barbara had been murdered by the notorious serial killer, Ted Bundy, that this was not personal, that she was just one of many victims. Ted Bundy had been arrested less than an hour away from where Barbara lived in Salt Lake City in 1975, just 1 year after her murder. And he had been killing college women all over the West Coast, including several in Utah, the same year Barbara was killed. But investigators in the late 1970s had ruled Ted Bundy out after determining he'd been committing a different murder in Washington state at the same time Barbara was killed, so he could not have been her killer. But it was still possible that Barbara had been killed by a different serial killer in the area. 1974 is notoriously known as the Year of Fear because there were so many killers operating in the United States at that time. But as Park read through the notes, he found himself agreeing with the original investigators' first instincts, that Barbara's murder must have been personal. Also, just the amount of times Barbara was shot seemed emotionally charged. And so Park believed Barbara's boyfriend, Richard Finder, had to be the killer. I mean, after all, Richard had been in the area at the time of the murder. He basically had no alibi. And, he brought up the fact that there was a missing murder weapon when the public didn't even know that. So he knows things about the crime scene that he shouldn't know. But Park felt like there were some other people in this case that also deserved a second look, like Barbara's best friend, Jerry Hicker. It was true he did have an alibi, and Barbara had told that pawn shop owner, before she was killed, that she was with her boyfriend, which she would not have referred to Jerry as. But if this was as emotional a crime as Park thought it was, Jerry had to be considered. After all, he was Barbara's closest friend at school, and maybe he heard she was leaving town and got mad at her. And then Barbara's roommates, they all seemed to have solid alibis, but maybe one of them had gotten somebody else to kill Barbara. I mean, Park knew the original investigators hadn't found any evidence of that, but they also hadn't seemed to spend much time on the roommates one way or another. They just kind of quickly ruled them out. But Park also knew it could be someone that they hadn't even considered yet, like the utility worker who actually found the body, or maybe another student at BYU who didn't like Barbara and considered her an outsider or a weirdo. Park wasn't sure yet, but he was confident that they'd be able to pick up some DNA somewhere in the evidence, and once they did, they'd find their killer. Two years later, on an afternoon in October of 2007, Park paced around his office and periodically stopped to look at the phone on his desk. He was waiting for a call from the lab, and with each passing moment, he got more and more anxious. So at this point in Park's re-investigation of Barbara's murder, the DNA testing had basically gotten them nowhere. Over the last 2 years, the medical lab had gone over almost every single item from Barbara's case, like her rape kit swabs and her clothes. But they hadn't been able to get any DNA from anything. It either wasn't there, or was just too old and not preserved well enough. And so the only thing left to test was the dirt that the original investigators collected from underneath Barbara's body. Park actually had not originally sent in the dirt because he didn't think it would have any DNA inside of it. But it was now the only piece of evidence that he had left. So Park knew that when the lab called this time, he'd either be on his way to finding the killer's name, or his case would basically be over. But then Park's phone finally rang. He immediately picked it up, and his mouth went dry when he heard it was the lab on the other end. And before Park could even ask them, they told him they had a profile. They'd been able to find traces of DNA in that dirt sample taken from under Barbara's body. And when Park finally got his hands on that DNA profile and he ran it through their criminal database, he got a name. Based on DNA evidence and a decades-long investigation, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Barbara Rockey on March 11th, 1974. Just before noon, the killer watched Barbara pull up to the sidewalk in her car. The killer immediately walked over and jumped inside and smiled at Barbara, and she smiled right back. And together, they drove to the pawn shop in Salt Lake City that Barbara wanted to go to. When they got there, Barbara hopped out of the car and went inside. And once she was inside, the killer moved over to the driver's seat, and so they basically were going to drive the car from that point forward. And as the killer sat in the driver's seat waiting for Barbara, their heart was racing. They couldn't wait for her to get back outside and get in the car because the killer was in love with her, and they had decided that today they were finally going to make their relationship physical. So when Barbara came outside and hopped in the passenger seat of the car after selling her necklace, the killer very excitedly turned to her and said, "Hey, there's some trails nearby. Why don't we go for a hike?" Barbara clearly hesitated, like she didn't really want to do this. But the killer knew Barbara was leaving Utah, and they knew she had written a goodbye note and was selling the necklace for funds to leave for good, so they kind of guilt-tripped her. They said, "Look, let's go enjoy the beautiful countryside before you leave town." Barbara shrugged and said, "Okay, fine." And so the killer very excitedly drove the car over to the canyon and parked near a picnic area. Then the two of them got out, and as they began walking towards a trail, the killer reached down and touched the outside of their pocket, just to make sure the gun that they had stolen from Barbara was still there. Now, they didn't know if they were going to use the gun or not, but they just wanted to make sure it was there and ready. And so for a while, the killer and Barbara just hiked along this trail, just chatting and making their way up and enjoying the scenery. But at some point, the killer they couldn't wait any longer. They had to make their move. And so they stopped Barbara, and the killer, after making sure nobody else was around, they moved forward and kind of made their move. They touched Barbara in a way that was very clearly meant to be romantic. But immediately Barbara kind of recoiled and jumped back and told the killer that she didn't want that, which immediately made the killer incredibly angry. And so the killer stepped towards her again and could see Barbara had this alarmed look on her face, which made them even more angry. So they pulled out Barbara's gun and they aimed it at her and then told her to take off her clothes. And Barbara, she was horrified, but, she did as she was told, but she intentionally was taking her time. As she took off a piece of clothing, she would painstakingly fold it very neatly, all the while begging the killer not to do this. And then after taking off all of her clothes and stacking them next to her, she continued to plead with the killer. But the killer was so humiliated and so angry that they decided enough was enough. And they shot Barbara right in the chest. And she crumpled to the ground, and they fired wildly several more times until Barbara went still. And then once Barbara was either dead or dying on the ground, the killer just panicked and turned and ran back down the trail, back to Barbara's car. They hopped in and they drove back to Provo and the BYU campus. But on the way there, they stopped and ditched Barbara's purse and the gun. And then when they actually got to Provo, the reason they parked Barbara's car down the road near that other apartment complex was so that when the killer got out of the car, Barbara's 7 roommates would not see them doing so. Then they fled, leaving Barbara's note in the car. Barbara's note was not a suicide note. It was a literal goodbye note that she had written for her roommates. But the killer figured it sort of seemed like a suicide note, so if they left it here, when they came back to find the car and find the note inside of it, they could tell the police that this seems like maybe Barbara has killed herself. It would send the police in a direction that would hopefully not lead back to the killer. It would turn out Barbara's killer was her best friend, Jerry Hicker. The original investigators didn't suspect Jerry at first, mainly because of his cooperation, and since he was the one who also first reported her missing. But they did begin to get suspicious of him when he eventually revealed his violent streak. The year after he killed Barbara, he was connected to a few different rape cases on campus. But they didn't have enough evidence to make an arrest until decades later, when the lab finally found DNA in the soil from the 1974 crime scene. They were able to match that profile to Jerry's DNA, which they had on file from his involvement in another unrelated crime. And so ultimately, Jerry killed Barbara with her own gun, which he had helped her buy so she could protect herself from killers just like him. By the time Jerry was arrested in 2007, he was dying of cancer. He confessed to Barbara's murder for a reduced sentence and served 5 years before he was released. He died in 2014. Thank you so much for watching. In the early afternoon on April 13th, 1985, 60-year-old Dorothy Thompson walked into a bank in St. Bernard, Louisiana. Her hip was really bothering her, so she was moving slowly, but at the same time, she was also trying extra hard not to limp or seem unsteady. She knew the people in her small town liked to gossip about her, and so she didn't want to give them anything new to talk about. But, as expected, despite her best efforts to conceal her slower, sort of limpy movement, when she got into the lobby, the handful of tellers and customers that were inside looked towards her, took stock of her, and began whispering. So the little town of St. Bernard was about 5 miles outside of New Orleans, and it was the kind of place where people were generally pretty friendly and everyone seemed to know everyone. But this smallness made it pretty easy for rumors to spread. And most of those rumors in this town seemed to be about Dorothy. Dorothy did have to admit, though, that she had given people a lot to talk about. Dorothy, who had lived in this town for 39 years, was the owner of the town's pet cemetery. Now, this pet cemetery was actually a true business. Dorothy made her income from pet owners, buying plots of land in the cemetery. But that wasn't really the thing that made, Dorothy stand out as the centerpiece of gossip. It was the fact that she not only owned this pet cemetery, but she lived on the cemetery by herself. And considering the fact that the cemetery also had a rumor of being haunted, it just seemed like, how could anybody do that? How could she live there full time? And these ghost stories, surrounding this pet cemetery were not just, to do with animals that had been buried there, but they were about people. Because people had died on this property, including both of Dorothy's husbands. The first husband was a very heavy drinker who regularly abused Dorothy. And it got so bad at a certain point that she eventually just shot him in self-defense and killed him. So that's how he died. And then her second husband had died from suicide. And Dorothy was the one who actually found his body on the porch. And so these deaths had led to more stories about Dorothy and how she was some kind of husband killer. But what people didn't see was how much all this death really weighed on her. And when her mother died about 6 years ago, it had almost broken Dorothy completely. Dorothy and her mother were incredibly close, and after she died, Dorothy got so depressed that she had to be admitted to the hospital for quite a while. She was doing better now, but some days were still really hard. And so now, at the bank, Dorothy ignored the look she got as she approached the teller. She needed to get cash out to pay her handyman, Kenny Pommier, who had done some work at the cemetery that morning. And because Dorothy didn't actually drive, Kenny was also her chauffeur for the day. And he was outside right now, waiting to take her on a few more errands. So Dorothy told the teller how much money she needed, and then after they counted it out and handed it to her, Dorothy took the cash, turned around, and headed back outside. A couple hours later, around 4 p.m., Dorothy sat in the passenger seat of Kenny's car as he drove down a highway. They had just wrapped up at the grocery store, and now he was taking her back home. As they drove, the two made some small talk, mostly about the weather and also the work that Kenny had done that morning on the grounds. But the truth was, Dorothy didn't really know Kenny at all. I mean, she had just hired him the day before. But he seemed nice enough, and she was hoping he would stick around for a while. After all, she had had a pretty high turnover rate amongst her handymen over the last year, and so she was hoping now for some consistency. So both the pet cemetery itself and Dorothy's house, which again was on the cemetery grounds, required a lot of upkeep that Dorothy was just not physically capable of doing. Besides her bad hip, she also took medication for her depression that made her weak and sometimes very disoriented. Now, sometimes Dorothy would ask her neighbors for help, but generally speaking, she preferred to just hire people to do the work because, people needed steady work, she could give that to them, and she appreciated the help. However, the problem with hiring these handymen was that unfortunately, a few of her, former handymen had turned out to be criminals. Last fall, her handyman at the time, this guy named Elkin Childress, had lived with her and worked on the grounds. But Elkin was always just sort of wandering around and exploring the property instead of taking care of it. Then she had found out he'd been arrested for robbery, so she guessed that what he was really doing when he was walking around was casing the place, looking for ways to break in or to steal something. Luckily for her, he actually quit before she had to fire him. And the guy before Elkin was even worse. His name was Brandon Nodier. Brandon was a total loudmouth who had started working for Dorothy right after her mother had died. He and his wife Bonnie had moved in with Dorothy, so Brandon could keep up with the repairs while Bonnie drove Dorothy around. But, just like Elkin, the issue she ran into with the Nodiers was theft. The previous spring, Dorothy had this really intense depressive episode and was taking a lot of medication for it. And while she was all, medicated and groggy, the Nodiers convinced her to sell them her land for basically nothing. But when Dorothy realized what had happened, she made the Nodiers move out and then got a lawyer to overturn the deal that she had signed. And so since last year, Dorothy, along with the Nodiers, had been in this horrible legal fight over this land. And she knew, the Nodiers, Brandon and Bonnie, were furious at her. And on top of that, Brandon, who was this huge loudmouth, just would not stop talking about this dispute. Not only was he talking about it in public, but he also kept contacting Dorothy to sort of talk her into dropping the suit altogether. But Dorothy was not about to drop this issue. I mean, this cemetery and the land had belonged to her mother, and now it was hers. Like, it mattered to her. She's not just gonna give it up. And so now, sitting in the passenger seat of the car, Dorothy watched as Kenny turned off the highway and eventually pulled into her driveway, which was quite long and wound through some thick woods, because remember, she lives on the cemetery. It's sort of secluded from society. And as the pair drove along this driveway and got closer and closer to her home, eventually she could finally see some of the tombstones up ahead. This cemetery was enormous, and basically any kind of animal you could imagine was buried here. Some of the graves were just engraved stone slabs, but others were pretty extravagant, including one human-sized Buddhist statue of somebody's pet cat. Kenny finally pulled up in front of the house and got out to help Dorothy carry in the groceries. And when he was done, Dorothy handed over the cash that she owed him and said she would call him when she had more work. And she watched as Kenny got back in his car and drove off back down the driveway. Around 9 p.m. that night, Dorothy poured herself a healthy glass of wine and went to her bedroom to turn on the TV. She'd spent the evening going through some bills and taking calls from cemetery clients, so by now she was exhausted. But as soon as she got into bed, she heard her phone ring on the other side of the house. Dorothy groaned and took her wine with her as she shuffled down the hallway to the kitchen to answer the call. And when she answered it, she heard her friend's voice, a woman named Patricia Newman. So Patricia was about half Dorothy's age, and the two of them had been introduced by a mutual friend 3 years earlier. Patricia had started out as more of a caretaker for Dorothy, since Patricia had experience working with the elderly. But they'd gotten along really well and became quite close, to the point where they had sort of a mother-daughter type of relationship. And since Patricia only lived about 10 minutes away, Dorothy did depend on her pretty much daily for things like supervising her medication and driving her to appointments. In many ways, Patricia was like the one person outside of the hired help that she did spend a lot of time with. And so that's actually why Patricia was calling now. She wanted to know if Dorothy still needed a ride to the pharmacy the following day. And Dorothy said that she did and said thank you. And then the two talked for a bit longer before ultimately saying goodnight. After that, Dorothy hung up the phone and then poured herself a bit more wine. And then she just kind of stood in the kitchen for a bit, listening to the crickets outside. And then, when she was about to finally leave and go back to bed, she heard something. It was the sound of a car making their way slowly up her long driveway. The following morning, a little after 1 p.m., the friend, Patricia Newman, pulled up outside of Dorothy's house and threw her car into park. Patricia had called Dorothy around 9 a.m. that morning to tell her she was going to be late getting her, but Dorothy hadn't answered. Patricia had tried calling a few more times, but Dorothy never answered, which ultimately made Patricia pretty nervous. Dorothy was a heavy drinker in her 60s and was on a lot of medication. So deep down, Patricia knew it was possible Dorothy wasn't answering because she had had some kind of accident or medical emergency. So she was at Dorothy's now, not so much to take her on her errands for the day, but just to make sure she was okay. Patricia got out of her car and hurried up to Dorothy's front door. But when she knocked, there was no answer. And after looking in a few windows, she didn't see Dorothy or any kind of movement inside. It just seemed very quiet and still. Patricia went back to the front door and tried it, but she found it was locked. So she just kept on knocking for a while. And after a few more minutes of Dorothy not answering and not hearing or seeing any sign of life in there, Patricia felt worried enough that she left the front door and went to go call the police. Not long after that, Patricia was back at Dorothy's house, this time watching anxiously as two police officers forced Dorothy's back door open. The officers had gotten there just a few minutes ago, and Patricia had explained to them how Dorothy, could be inside and very likely was hurt or something was wrong here. And so the officers kind of fanned out and began searching around the house looking for a way in, and they found the back door was not locked, it was just jammed. So now they were in the process of getting it unjammed. And so finally, after a few swift kicks to this door, it finally gave way and it swung open, and the two officers, along with Patricia, went inside. Patricia immediately began yelling out Dorothy's name and going room to room looking for her, and what she quickly realized is she could hear the sound of a television that was on, and it was coming from Dorothy's bedroom. But when she went to the bedroom and looked inside, Dorothy wasn't in there. In fact, after searching the whole house, there was no sign of Dorothy anywhere. And there wasn't any sign of any kind of problem in the house, like there was no disturbance anywhere, no struggle, no accident where somebody fell over. It was just like Dorothy was gone, and that was it. Now, for the two officers, they didn't really know what to make of this, because to them, it didn't appear like anything horrible had happened. There was no active emergency here. It's just that, this person has left their TV on and they're not here when they should be. And that was concerning, but not enough to warrant a big reaction from authorities. But Patricia, she knew, based on what she was seeing, that this was so uncharacteristic of Dorothy that something definitely had gone wrong here. But even though Patricia really adamantly communicated that concern to the two officers, they just told her that, let's wait, give it a few days, and give Dorothy another couple of calls, and if she doesn't show up in the next few days, come talk to us. And so after the police left, despite Patricia having this sense that something's off here, she did what she was told. She went home, she continued trying Dorothy, but never got an answer. She called around town to see if anybody had seen her or heard from her, but no, nobody knew where she was. And so finally, after 4 days, Patricia put in another call to the St. Bernard Sheriff's Office. And this time, she absolutely begged them to do something, because Dorothy Thompson was still missing, and now Patricia was 100% certain that something bad had to have happened to her. At around 10:30 a.m. on the same day that Patricia has made this plea for help 4 days after Dorothy had inexplicably gone missing, Detective Brian Vallelongo drove his cruiser through Dorothy Thompson's pet cemetery along with Sergeant Terrence Strada. Both men worked for the St. Bernard Sheriff's Office, and they had been tasked to look into Dorothy's disappearance. Vallelongo hadn't even gotten to the scene yet, but he was already uneasy as he drove past the animal tombstones and grave sites. This place had always creeped him out. Finally, the officer's cruiser made their way all the way to the end of the driveway, and they reached Dorothy's home. And right away, Vallelongo could see there was a woman, maybe in her 30s, who he guessed was Patricia, who was standing by the front door. She seemed visibly anxious and impatient as she stood there waiting for Vallelongo and Strada to get out of their car. And when they did get out and walked over to her, she got straight to the point. She said the last officers had not actually done a real search of the place, just a sort of basic welfare check. And so now she needed them to do a full search of Dorothy's house and her grounds to make sure Dorothy really wasn't somewhere on this property. Vallelongo and Strada assured her that they would do that. But first, they needed her to start from the beginning and tell them about the last time she saw or spoke to Dorothy. Patricia seemed pretty irritated by this and said she had already told the officers everything she had known, both on the phone call and then previously with those other officers who had done the welfare check. Can we please just get into the search? But Vallelongo insisted and said, look, I don't fully know the whole story, so please, give me some information. And so, begrudgingly, she would tell Vallelongo what she knew. Basically that she had called her friend on the 13th at night to ask if Dorothy would need a ride to the pharmacy the next day. She had said yes, and then the next day comes around and Patricia calls her friend to confirm she's going to swing by and pick her up that morning, but Dorothy doesn't answer. And so eventually Patricia goes to the house. Dorothy apparently isn't there. She knocks on the door. Dorothy doesn't come out. It just seemed off. And so Patricia calls the police. They show up. They find the back door is unlocked, but jammed. They force it open. They go inside and, nothing's disturbed. And Dorothy is just missing. And there was no rhyme or reason to it. And so now Patricia was convinced that something bad had happened to Dorothy. And she really was hoping that they could help her. Vallelongo nodded and then asked Patricia if maybe Dorothy had friends or family that she might have just gone to stay with. But Patricia immediately shook her head and said no. Dorothy was pretty much alone in the world and almost never left her house. And she didn't have a car because she didn't drive. Also, Patricia said she had already called around and nobody had seen her. Friends, family, no one. And then at this point, Patricia was very clear. She told the officers that she believed the only reason Dorothy would have left her house that day or that night before was if somebody else had forced her to. Vallelongo shot Strada a look. He didn't doubt that Patricia was worried about her friend, but they need to look around before they jump to any conclusions here. So he asked Patricia if she could show them the unlocked door, and they would begin their investigation. Moments later, Vallelongo stepped into the home through that back entrance, followed by Strada and Patricia. As he walked around the house, he saw that, like Patricia had said, it was very neat and tidy. There really was no sign of anything that had gone wrong inside the house. No sign of a struggle or a fall of some kind. It was just like the house was left exactly as is. That sort of contradicted Patricia's theory that, the only way Dorothy would have left the house was if she had been forced, suggesting some form of a struggle. But at the same time, what Patricia was saying about Dorothy is that she was kind of frail. And so Vallelongo thought, okay, maybe it's possible that she was forced and, she didn't put up any kind of a fight, and that's why we don't see any disturbance. He didn't know, but it just seemed odd that nothing had been displaced if we're talking about some form of an abduction. Also, as Vallelongo continued his walk around the house, he could see that items of value, like Dorothy's TV, were still there. So it didn't seem like this had been a robbery. But unlike the first officers who had done that initial welfare check with Patricia a few days earlier, Vallelongo did agree that something wasn't right here. Because as he continued to walk around, he kept seeing signs that Dorothy had clearly not planned to leave her home or had left in a hurry. For example, there was a half-empty glass of wine in the kitchen, and the television in the bedroom was still on. And so those are things that simply would not be if somebody was planning to leave for any extended period of time. And also, based on what Patricia had told them, he could rule out a family emergency suddenly taking Dorothy out of town or any kind of last-minute trip, because Patricia had called around and that stuff hadn't happened. At a certain point, Vallelongo stopped walking around the home and just asked Patricia, how was Dorothy's mental state? And Patricia clearly hesitated for a second before she admitted to Vallelongo that, Dorothy was on a whole bunch of medication, and sometimes it did make her mental state kind of foggy. And so Vallelongo naturally thought, okay, maybe it's possible that in a sort of foggy mental state, maybe for whatever reason, she wandered out of the house on her own, and then once she was outside, something happened to her, whether it was, an animal, a person, a fall, like anything could have happened. He knew the back door had been unlocked during that initial police welfare check. And even though he knew the door apparently had been jammed, it clearly had not been jammed so much that it prevented them from getting inside. And so maybe that door just always got stuck, and maybe that's all that happened. She walked out the back door, and when she shut it, it got jammed, and that was normal. And so Vallelongo turned to his partner and sort of explained to him his theory around Dorothy maybe wandering out on her own, and then something else happened once she was outside, and said, hey, she's clearly not here. Let's go out there and search the grounds and see if we can find her. "15 days later, a little past 7 a.m. on May 3rd, 1985, Vallelongo stepped into Strada's office to give him an update on the case. At this point, Vallelongo thought it was extremely likely that foul play was involved here, because they had searched Dorothy's house and her property a few times at this point, and they had not found Dorothy anywhere, or any evidence to explain what had happened to her. Patricia had mentioned that Dorothy had a tattoo of a cross on her left index finger. So Vallelongo had spent the last couple of weeks calling around to local hospitals and morgues to see if any women had been brought in with that marking. Vallelongo also interviewed Dorothy's neighbors and the tellers at that bank that she had gone to shortly before she vanished, and also he had interviewed some people in town who just knew who she was. He'd also tracked down Dorothy's new handyman, Kenny Pommier, who the bank had said was with Dorothy on the day she vanished. He apparently was driving her around. But none of these people had heard from Dorothy since she vanished 20 days earlier, same as Patricia. Even though nobody knew where Dorothy was and really couldn't offer all that much information to help the investigation, it was like everybody Vallelongo spoke to had a pretty strong negative opinion of Dorothy. Like that she was this recluse and that she was kind of crazy, and people thought she had murdered her husbands and buried their bodies in the pet cemetery, and also her house and her land were haunted. But none of these rumors were going to do anything to advance the case. But it was interesting to Vallelongo that people felt this way about her. The only real lead that Vallelongo got was something he got from speaking to Dorothy's lawyer a few days ago, who had mentioned that Dorothy was in the middle of this very contentious lawsuit over the rights to her property with a pair of former employees named Bonnie and Brandon Nodier. And since Dorothy's case was looking more and more like an abduction or even homicide, the fact that there was this active lawsuit that Dorothy was embroiled in was a big red flag. So Vallelongo naturally knew he had to speak to Bonnie and Brandon. But as Vallelongo sat across from Strada at his desk and filled him in on all this, Strada's phone rang. Strada picked it up and listened to the person on the other end, and immediately there was this look of shock that came over his face. Strada thanked the caller and then hung up, and then told Vallelongo that a body had been found in the Mississippi River the day before, about 40 miles downriver from here, and they thought it could be Dorothy. Just a few hours later, Vallelongo and Strada stood with Patricia Newman inside of an exam room at the coroner's office. In front of them was a long metal table, and lying on this table was the body of the woman who had been found inside the river. Patricia had been asked to come in here and see if this was Dorothy. But as Vallelongo looked at the body, he didn't see how Patricia was going to be able to do that, because the body was already incredibly decomposed and very bloated. The medical examiner had said this woman had likely been in the water for weeks, and they hadn't done an autopsy yet, but any findings would probably just be a guess because of how badly damaged and decomposed the body was. The only thing they did know for sure was that this definitely was a homicide. The woman was found with a plastic bag tied over her head, and she was wrapped in a lot of very heavy chains, probably to weigh her down so her body would not float up and be found. And so Vallelongo looked over at Patricia, who looked visibly anxious as she stared at this body. She seemed kind of overwhelmed by the moment. She was shaking and she was just staring, sort of shocked. But eventually, after looking at the body, she spoke. And she actually said that she didn't think this was Dorothy. And for a second, Vallelongo was actually disappointed, not because he was hoping Dorothy was dead, but for the sake of the case, to figure out where she had gone. But then he remembered something. He stepped up to the body, he put on a glove, and gently examined the woman's left hand. And there, just visible on her index finger, was a tattoo of a cross. This was Dorothy. Four days later, on May 7th, Vallelongo got to his office and sat down at his desk to start the day. And he had a lot to do, because he was now in the middle of a homicide case. The medical examiner who had done the autopsy on Dorothy didn't find any water in her lungs. So as a result, they had decided the cause of death was most likely asphyxia from strangulation or suffocation, not drowning. Now, Vallelongo had known all along that it was possible somebody had abducted Dorothy from her home and killed her. But now that it was official, he was sort of reviewing the case notes from the beginning to see if anything had been overlooked, while this was still basically considered a missing persons case. And he started with the place Dorothy was last known to be, her house. Dorothy's home was incredibly neat and undisturbed, so it was possible Dorothy was lured from her home and killed somewhere else. But Vallelongo knew from talking to her neighbors and Patricia that Dorothy was, naturally pretty reclusive and did not leave her house easily. So it sort of made the most sense to him that Dorothy must have actually been killed in her home, and the reason the crime scene was so pristine was that Dorothy was overpowered really quickly. Now, originally, Vallelongo had considered Dorothy's current handyman, Kenny Pommier, to be a suspect, since he was the last one to see her alive, because he was the one who dropped her off at her home at 4 p.m., around the time she went missing. But Vallelongo had revisited Kenny and found that he had an alibi. But even if he didn't have an alibi, Vallelongo wasn't really sure what Kenny's motive would even have been. I mean, there'd been no sign of a robbery inside of her house, and on top of that, it just didn't seem like Dorothy had much money to begin with, like she wasn't wealthy. And also the way she died, strangulation or suffocation, that's so personal. And so whoever would have done that would have had to have a reason for it. But so far, Vallelongo had not spoken to anyone who really had a serious issue with Dorothy. I mean, people definitely had opinions about Dorothy, but it was almost like people said, stay away from her. She lives on haunted land and she's killed her husbands, but it just seemed like rumor mill. There didn't seem to be somebody who really had a targeted issue with her. There was that outstanding lawsuit with the Nodiers, the two people who were, battling over the rights to her property, but it wasn't clear to Vallelongo if in the middle of this lawsuit was like real hatred between the parties. He had yet to see that. And so at this point, Vallelongo felt like his biggest problem was that he really had no real evidence. There were no witnesses, and they'd searched Dorothy's house repeatedly at this point, and they hadn't found anything useful. And there were no forensics on Dorothy's body. Since her body had been in the water for so long, all the forensics had been washed away. But just then, there was a knock on the door, and an officer poked his head in and told Vallelongo that he had something that he might want to come see. And so Vallelongo got up and he walked over, and the officer said that they had just brought this guy in for writing bad checks, and it turns out his former employer was Dorothy Thompson. Vallelongo was immediately interested and asked for more information. And the officer told him that this man's name was Elkin Childress, and he had been the live-in caretaker for Dorothy for 2 months last fall. And Elkin had told the officers who had arrested him that the reason he had wanted to work there at the pet cemetery for Dorothy was to find the treasure. Apparently, along with all the other rumors about Dorothy, there was another rumor that hundreds of thousands of dollars were, buried somewhere on Dorothy's property. And Elkin had become obsessed with finding it, but he said he never did. When Vallelongo heard this, he felt his pulse pick up. He'd never heard this treasure rumor, but it wasn't any crazier than any of the other rumors he had heard about Dorothy. And if Elkin was that serious about finding, said treasure, maybe he'd gone to Dorothy and tried to force her to tell him where it was. But before he could say or do anything, the officer told Vallelongo not to get too excited, because Elkin had an alibi for the night Dorothy went missing, and it checked out. However, the officer said that Elkin had mentioned something else that could help with the investigation. According to Elkin, there was somebody in Dorothy's life who befriended her for the sole purpose of trying to inherit everything she owned. And that person was Patricia Newman. And as soon as the officer said that, Vallelongo's gears in his head began to turn, and he thought, why didn't I see this before? After all, it was Patricia who called the authorities. She's also the one who aggressively pushed this investigation in the early days, which, Vallelongo had assumed was just because she was worried about her friend. But now he was starting to wonder if maybe she was trying to make herself look innocent. It's not unusual for killers to try and insert themselves into investigations to seem cooperative or to cast suspicion on other people. Patricia had also entered Dorothy's house multiple times before Dorothy's body was found, which certainly gave her an opportunity to interact with the scene and potentially hide evidence. And so Vallelongo turned and ran to go find Strada. They needed to speak to Patricia immediately, and this time it would be as a suspect. On May 8th, so 6 days after Dorothy was found in the river, Vallelongo once again met with Dorothy's close friend, Patricia Newman. But this time, the meeting was inside of a police interrogation room. And as Vallelongo sat at the interrogation table looking at Patricia, he was watching her very carefully. She did seem somewhat annoyed that she had been called in for this. but she also seemed very nervous. In particular, she kept fidgeting with her hands. Now, Vallelongo had really considered his approach here. Since Patricia could have been lying to him this whole time, his plan was to start off pleasant and kind of lull her into a false sense of security that he believed everything she had said was true so far. And then at some point he would surprise her with a sharp left turn and see how she reacted. So he started with some background questions about Patricia's relationship with Dorothy and nodded appreciatively as Patricia explained how she and Dorothy were good friends and Patricia also took care of her. But then, kind of out of nowhere, Vallelongo asked her about Dorothy's estate and if it was valuable or not. She did say that Dorothy owned the house and the land it was on outright, so no mortgages or anything, so it had to be worth something, but she didn't know how much it was worth. Vallelongo responded to this by saying, okay, forget the financial worth of the property. Is the property worth something to you, Patricia? At that point, Vallelongo could clearly see, Patricia realizing what was happening here. She had this alarmed look on her face, like she was starting to see that she was not being treated like a witness, but rather a suspect. And so Patricia quickly said, no, the property was not worth anything to her. She didn't want it, not at all. But she kind of turned it around on Vallelongo and said, look, if you're looking for someone who does want that property, well, you ought to speak to the Nodiers. Now, Vallelongo knew who she was referencing. These were the folks who were embroiled in that lawsuit with Dorothy before she went missing and was found dead. But Vallelongo didn't say anything. He just sort of gave Patricia a look like, oh, explain what you mean. And so Patricia took the cue and told him that the Nodiers had been Dorothy's live-in employees for years, and they were complete monsters. She said that Brandon had been verbally abusive towards Dorothy while he worked for her, and also he was one of the main people spreading all these rumors about Dorothy in town, about how he thought she killed her husbands and how her land was haunted and she was crazy. But she said that wasn't even the worst of it. She said Brandon was also a thief. She said the year before, when Dorothy was on a lot of medication for depression, like more than normal, and she was not of sound mind as a result of it, she said that Brandon and his wife Bonnie had convinced her to sign over her property to them for basically nothing. And that's when it hit Vallelongo. Like, he was aware that there had been this lawsuit over the land, but he didn't really have all the details about it. He just knew there was some dispute. And he also knew that Dorothy's lawyer had mentioned the Nodiers days ago, but that was also right before Dorothy's body had turned up and things had been sort of hectic, and so Vallelongo had not followed up with her lawyers yet. And so he didn't really have the context of, how nasty this legal fight really was. Patricia said she had convinced Dorothy to get a lawyer and to fight this, that it was not right they were doing this to her. And Dorothy had done that. She'd gotten a lawyer, and in fact, her and the Nodiers' court date had happened just 10 days before Dorothy went missing. As Vallelongo was listening, it was like he couldn't believe it. This was so obvious, and it was right in front of him the whole time. The Nodiers would clearly benefit from Dorothy's disappearance, and pretty clearly, there was real beef between the parties. So at this point, Vallelongo kind of shifted tactics and was less interested in looking at Patricia as a suspect, and instead assured her that, he would speak to them. Now, Vallelongo did speak to Patricia for a bit longer. I mean, she was still a suspect. She was very close to Dorothy, who was this older woman with no obvious heirs. And Vallelongo had not seen Dorothy's will yet, but, he wouldn't be that surprised if Patricia was in there. And if she was, that would prove she would have also benefited from Dorothy's demise, just like the Nodiers would. But regardless, Vallelongo knew he was well overdue for a conversation with the Nodiers. So they were going to be his next call. 3 days later, in the afternoon on May 10th, Vallelongo found himself back in the precinct's interrogation room, but this time it was a bit more crowded. He'd managed to track down 31-year-old Brandon Nodier for an interview, and while Brandon had agreed to talk to Vallelongo, he had also insisted on having his lawyer present as well, which immediately signaled to Vallelongo that Brandon likely had something to hide here. Vallelongo had looked into Brandon's background since speaking to Patricia, and he found out that Brandon had a criminal record, which included assault. Vallelongo also spoke to a few people in town about Brandon, and he had been told that Brandon apparently had a very hard time keeping his mouth shut. He apparently consistently seemed to threaten or go off on people whenever he got even marginally upset. He was a hothead and a loudmouth. So, given all this, Vallelongo expected Brandon to be at least somewhat antagonistic or defensive in this interview. But when Vallelongo asked him about this, highly contentious lawsuit with Dorothy, Brandon didn't seem like an angry loudmouth at all. Instead, he just seemed confused. He explained the whole thing really was just a big misunderstanding. Brandon said he and his wife had known Dorothy for 6 years and actually lived with her for part of the time. And from his point of view, he thought, Dorothy viewed them as sort of like family. And that's also why he said he believed she was selling them her land at such a low rate. It was like a family discount. He said it just sort of seemed like she really wanted them to have her property. And it was actually Brandon and his wife that had sort of insisted on paying for it. Brandon said, everything about this transaction had really been fine and above board until Patricia Newman got involved. Brandon seemed very frustrated as he began to explain how he didn't really know what had happened, but Patricia somehow got into Dorothy's head and convinced her that he and his wife Bonnie had somehow taken advantage of Dorothy. And Brandon saying that didn't happen. That's not how this went. Brandon said, as far as he was concerned, it actually seemed like Patricia was the one who was taking advantage of Dorothy. And then he said there were actually all these times when apparently Patricia was staying with Dorothy, and at some point they would get into some kind of fight, and Patricia would get mad at Dorothy, and Dorothy would flee her own house and run to the Nodier's house, for protection, for safe haven. They said that was fairly common. Patricia was this awful person that, Dorothy had to flee from. As Vallelongo heard this, he kind of didn't know what to think. I mean, Brandon could be lying to him, but truthfully, Brandon seemed very convincing. And also, Brandon just didn't really seem smart enough to be a master manipulator here. In fact, if anything, Brandon seemed kind of dense, and it was hard to believe he could engineer this murder without leaving behind any evidence or witnesses, and then also concoct this sort of brilliant story about how Patricia really was the one behind this whole thing. But Brandon's wife, Bonnie, was a suspect too, and it was possible that, she was the ringleader, and Brandon had just sort of followed along. They were divorced now, but if they were wrapped up in this lawsuit with Dorothy together, it was possible they could have, come together and joined forces to take care of the problem, i.e., get rid of Dorothy. All that's to say, Vallelongo was not going to eliminate Brandon as a suspect just yet, but he needed more evidence before he could connect him to the crime. So ultimately, he told Brandon he could leave and that he would be in touch. And then Vallelongo watched as Brandon and his lawyer stood up and filed out of the room. It was sort of funny in a dark way that just a few days ago, Vallelongo couldn't see any reason why anybody would want to kill Dorothy. And now it was like everybody in Dorothy's life, Elkin, Patricia, and now the Nodiers, wanted Dorothy's money and so really would benefit if she went away. And so now he just had to figure out who wanted Dorothy gone the most. About 5 months later, in October of 1985, Vallelongo stood in the middle of Dorothy's pet cemetery along with Sergeant Strada in total disbelief. Because all around them, almost every single tombstone had been completely smashed. Now, Vallelongo had no idea who had done this, but it was sort of oddly fitting, because just like this cemetery, Vallelongo's homicide case was a complete and total mess. Since May, Vallelongo and some other investigators had questioned both Patricia and Brandon Nodier multiple times, but all they ever did was point the finger at the other one. And now, the two primary suspects in Dorothy's murder were essentially at war over her property. After Dorothy's will was read, it would turn out that Patricia Newman had inherited a huge chunk of her estate, including whatever proceeds came from the cemetery business. But the Nodiers were saying that no, you cannot just give that to Patricia because the property is theirs and so the business is theirs because Dorothy had signed it all over to them. And the lawsuit to overturn that sale, despite it being very contentious, it had not been resolved yet. So you can't just shuffle it over to Patricia. And on top of that, Bonnie Nodier, Brandon's ex-wife, had literally moved into Dorothy's house, making it even more complicated. And so that was why the St. Bernard Sheriff's Department and the state police were at the pet cemetery right now. Patricia was there and trying to get access to the house since she needed to get some of Dorothy's things, and Bonnie wouldn't let her in. Now, the uniformed officers had just gone there to make sure everybody played nice, but Vallelongo and Strada had tagged along specifically to try to ask Bonnie a few questions. Now, Bonnie was still very much a suspect in Dorothy's murder, but so far, investigators had actually not been able to interview her, and Vallelongo had hoped that maybe this was their chance. However, when they arrived, Bonnie was extremely angry and she refused to speak to anyone and told all the officers and Patricia to get off her property. And even though the officers, along with Patricia, had eventually gotten inside and Patricia took what she needed, the officers had not been able to get Bonnie to say anything to them. She refused. And so now, Vallelongo and Strada walked back to their cruiser, past all these shattered tombstones, feeling very frustrated that they had multiple suspects here and no way to eliminate any of them. Brandon Nodier would directly benefit from Dorothy's death, because if she was dead, then the lawsuit he was embroiled in would get dropped and he would by default take control of Dorothy's land. He also had a criminal record and, according to Patricia, had been horrible to Dorothy when they lived together. Brandon's ex-wife, Bonnie, could have helped him do it too, since after all, she was named in that lawsuit as well. And she had taken full control of Dorothy's house after she died, so clearly she was intent on living there. But Patricia also could have been highly motivated to get Dorothy out of the picture, since she was named in the will. And she'd seemed really controlling of Dorothy and had repeatedly inserted herself into the investigation. And then there was the handyman, Elkin Childress, who had been eliminated through his alibi, but Vallelongo felt like he deserved another look. He had admitted that he was obsessed with finding treasure on Dorothy's property, and now all the gravestones were mysteriously smashed, which could indicate that maybe he had come back and this was, part of his attempt to find the treasure. Maybe they were inside the gravestones. Then again, if they're going to treat Elkin like a suspect, well, then anybody who had heard rumors about the treasure on Dorothy's land was also a suspect. And considering how the residents of St. Bernard clearly gossiped a lot about Dorothy, it seemed like that would mean basically everyone in town was a suspect. But without any forensic evidence or witnesses, Vallelongo didn't see how they would ever be able to connect anybody to this crime. Still, he and Strada got back in the cruiser and headed back to the station to keep at it. The investigative team kept working this case diligently for weeks and then months, interviewing and re-interviewing suspects and speaking to people who knew Dorothy. They even met with a psychic who claimed she knew who the killer was. And some people even called in with tips that they had seen Dorothy's ghost in the area and they would even go follow up in case maybe Dorothy was there. But none of that went anywhere. None of it amounted to any new, meaningful evidence that the police could actually use to bring somebody to court. And as time went on, Dorothy's case changed hands multiple times before finally going cold. "24 years later, on a Thursday afternoon in late September of 2009, Detective John Duran sat at his desk in the St. Bernard's police precinct doing some paperwork. And he just put his pen down and leaned back in his chair to take a break when another detective poked his head in and told Duran, hey, the caller was on the phone. And Duran knew exactly who he was talking about. A few days ago, an anonymous caller had put in a tip to say he had information about an old cold case from 1985, the murder of the lady who owned that pet cemetery. And Duran had known immediately that the caller was talking about Dorothy Thompson. Duran had actually used to cut the grass at the pet cemetery when he was 15 years old, and so he and his friends knew all about Dorothy. How she was, this eccentric recluse who potentially murdered people and who turned up dead one day. But during the first call, this tipster had gotten spooked and hung up without giving his name. And as soon as Duran picked up the phone to speak to the caller, he immediately said, whoever this is, you're not going to get in any trouble here. We just want your name and your location. I want to come talk to you and just hear what you know. You're not going to get in any trouble. Can you do that? There was a pause, and then the caller reluctantly agreed. Later that day, Duran and another detective sat in the living room of a New Orleans home, right across from a very fidgety-looking older man. The man's eyes kept darting all around the room, and periodically he kept looking over his shoulder like somebody was gonna, jump out at him. And it occurred to Duran as he was watching this guy that he didn't just seem nervous, about the information he was going to spill to them. He actually seemed pretty genuinely terrified. But finally, the man took a steadying breath and said he knew who killed Dorothy, and he had known for years. Now, the guilt of knowing was haunting him, literally. He told the detectives that he had been seeing Dorothy's ghost, covered in chains, and asking him to come forward. Now, at this, Duran raised his eyebrows skeptically, but didn't say anything. This was a pretty crazy start to the story and pretty hard to believe. But at the same time, it didn't really matter what, prompted this guy to come forward. It mattered what he had to say. And so, with an open mind, Duran, along with his partner, just sat there and waited. And eventually, the old man, despite being very scared and timid, finally did just come out and say what he knew. Based on a decades-long investigation and multiple confessions, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Dorothy Thompson on the night of April 13th, 1985. Sometime after 9 p.m. that night, the killer was sitting behind the wheel of their truck, making their way up the long, winding driveway through the woods towards Dorothy's house. And as they drove along, the killer found themselves sort of looking out the window and taking in the sights, the tombstones, the trees, the house up ahead, the whole property, taking it all in. And as they did that, they thought to themselves that it was time to stop waiting for their fortune to arrive. They needed to take it. Because Dorothy did not deserve to have this. In fact, the killer believed Dorothy didn't deserve to live. And so the killer eventually arrived right outside of Dorothy's house, and they stopped their truck, they threw it in park, and then, calm as can be, they got out and they walked around to the back of the house. There, they knocked. And eventually, Dorothy, made her way to the door, and she looked out through the glass and she saw this person, the killer, and she looked confused. But it didn't stop her from opening the door. And as soon as she did, the killer didn't hesitate. They jumped on top of her. Dorothy tried to scream, but the killer immediately wrapped their hands tight around her throat, and she went silent. And then in silence, they strangled Dorothy until she stopped moving. Then, once Dorothy was crumpled, lifeless on the ground, the killer found some sheets and wrapped them around Dorothy's body and then dragged her outside to the waiting truck. Once they put Dorothy's body in the truck, they drove to a section of the Mississippi River not far from Dorothy's house. There, the killer got out, and they grabbed Dorothy's body, and they tied her hands and her feet together, and also, just in case, put a plastic bag tightly over her head. Then they wrapped her body in chains. And then once she was all prepped, the killer, calm as can be, lifted her body up, walked over to the Mississippi River, and threw her in. Moments later, the killer was back inside their truck, driving along, feeling better than they had in months. Because now that Dorothy was gone, all their problems were solved. It would turn out Dorothy Thompson's killer was indeed Brandon Nodier. He had not only tricked Dorothy into selling him her land at a very cheap price, but also, when she figured out he had basically conned her, she sued him at Patricia's urging. And when that happened, Brandon thought, okay, well, if I just kill Dorothy before this lawsuit gets dismissed, because they're going to figure out that this was not fair, that I did con her. If I kill her now, well, by default, the charges get dropped and the sale goes to me. The property is mine. On the night of the murder, Brandon was not alone. He actually asked another one of Dorothy's former handymen, a guy named James Tregler, to come along with him and basically just wait in the car. And so he had done that. Now, Brandon was an incredibly violent person, and he did not think twice about murdering Dorothy to make sure the lawsuit got dropped. But Brandon also had a famously big mouth, and he told his entire friend group what he had done. And so basically, all of Brandon's friends were aware of this horrible crime, and they totally believed what he said because they were fully capable of him being able to commit extreme violence, but they were scared of him. And that's why none of the friends came forward to say, what they knew. But finally, one of these friends was so haunted by their knowledge of this crime that they did eventually come forward. That was the caller who, told the detectives what happened. And in their rendition of what happened, they said Brandon didn't act alone. There was somebody else, a guy named James Tregler. And so as a result of that tip, it would take another 4 years, but they would ultimately speak to James Tregler, and he would confess to having been there on that night. And with that, they had enough evidence to finally charge Brandon for the murder. Brandon ultimately surrendered to authorities in 2012, and he would get a 10-year sentence for pleading guilty to Dorothy's murder. Brandon's ex-wife, Bonnie, was not involved. As for James Tregler, the other handyman who drove with Brandon on the night of the murder, he always maintained that he didn't know the murder was going to happen, and so he was given immunity from prosecution in exchange for his testimony. Even though the pet cemetery is still standing today, it's now abandoned and totally overgrown. However, treasure hunters continue to walk around the property, with their metal detectors, hoping that they'll be the ones to finally find the treasure that's buried there. On the night of July 24th, 1987, 30-year-old Susan Woods stood at the entrance to a local fair in a little city called Hyco, located in central Texas, along with her best friend and her best friend's boyfriend. And the three of them were standing there trying to decide if they wanted to continue to stay here or leave. Now, as they're standing there, they can hear people having fun on all the rides. There's kids laughing and they're screaming. I mean, it's a Friday night. They had chosen to come here. This was the activity. But, so far the night had really not been that great. So Susan's best friend, whose name was Cindy Hallmark, and her boyfriend, whose name was Roy Hayes, had convinced Susan to come out with them and come to this fair, because Susan's life of late had been really quite bad. She was in the middle of this very ugly divorce, and the new guy that she was dating had sort of wound up being very pushy when it came to physical intimacy, and so she had recently dumped him too. And so, Susan's life, certainly her relationships anyways, were sort of in rough shape. And so Cindy and Roy had convinced Susan to come out with them and just, at least for one night, come enjoy this fair. Just forget about everything else and just come have some fun. And so Susan had agreed to go. However, sort of ironically, once they actually got to the fair and the three of them were walking around and playing games and going into the haunted house and doing all the things you do at the fair, it had been Cindy, not Susan, who had ultimately said that they weren't really having a good time, that they were feeling kind of bad. Cindy said that she just had this really intense feeling that something bad was about to happen. It was like this constant anxiety, and she couldn't shake it, and it was making it really hard to enjoy the night. And so that was why the trio is, standing at the gate, wondering if it's even worth staying here any longer. And ultimately, Roy finally just said, you know what, why don't we just leave and head back to Stephenville? That's where they all lived. It's where they grew up, too. And he said, why don't we go back to Stephenville and we'll just drive around for a bit, and eventually we'll go to the Dairy Queen restaurant and we'll get some ice cream. And when Roy suggested this, both Susan and Cindy thought that was a great idea. And so they left, they hopped in Roy's truck, and they began the drive back to Stephenville. About an hour and a half later, Susan, Cindy, and Roy walked into the Stephenville Dairy Queen. They ordered ice cream sundaes and then sat down at a booth. By this point, Cindy's feeling of dread, that something bad was going to happen, had mostly gone away, and so the mood was much lighter. And Susan especially was actually having kind of a great night, the first in a long time it felt like. The last 6 months or so had been some of the worst in Susan's entire life. Her ex-husband, Michael Woods, who she had been with since she was in her early 20s, had effectively abandoned her back in February, taking her car and also some expensive crystals that she had collected, and he had left behind a viciously mean tape recording of all the things he hated about her, along with dozens of cruel notes with insults on them hidden all over the place. And so Susan had filed for divorce, and then instead of trying to get her car back from her husband, who was long gone, she just began doing a ton of overtime at the sandpaper factory in order to afford another car. And so in these few months immediately following the breakup with her ex and all this extra work she was doing, Susan had really fallen into a deep depression. But it had been Cindy and Roy who had helped kind of pull herself back together. Susan was naturally very shy, and she did not have a big social circle. But Cindy, on the other hand, was very extroverted, had a ton of friends and a lot of close cousins. And so she had persuaded Susan to begin coming to their regular meetups with all her friends and cousins. The core group that typically attended these meetups was Cindy, Roy, Cindy's cousins, Regina and Scott Hatley, and then maybe one or two others. And collectively, they referred to themselves as the members of the round table, because often these meetups consisted of just spending the whole night sitting around Cindy's round kitchen table, talking and drinking. The first time Susan had gone, it had seemed like such a tight-knit group that she really just kind of felt like a third wheel and did not belong. But everyone had really treated her like she did belong. And these days, she did not miss a meetup because this was like her new community. It really made her happy. And so slowly but surely, Susan had begun to feel better, largely because of these meetups. And so now, as she looked across the table at Cindy jokingly trying to force-feed Roy all this ice cream, Susan just smiled. Roy was this big guy, but he was losing the fight, and he had chocolate sauce all over his chin. They were just kind of goofing around. She just thought to herself, you know what? Tonight was a great night. My life, it's turning around. And suddenly, she had an idea. Susan stood up from the table, and without saying anything, she walked up to the counter, and she promptly ordered a second hot fudge sundae. And when she carried it back over to the table with a big grin on her face, Cindy and Roy kind of looked at her surprised, and were kind of impressed even, which was exactly the reaction that Susan was hoping for. Normally, Susan was very conscious of her weight and wouldn't even finish one sundae. But tonight, she just felt like, you know what? I have been set free. I'm just going to have fun. But unfortunately for Susan, the ice cream sundaes were really the last fun thing she got to enjoy that entire weekend, because she spent all day Saturday on the line at the sandpaper factory where she worked, and then all day Sunday she was grocery shopping, doing laundry, and straightening up the house. By about 8 p.m. Sunday night, she had put away all of her laundry, she had made the bed, and picked up the last few items off the bedroom floor. Her house was small, but it was finally starting to feel like hers again. When her ex-husband Michael had first left, even though he had gone 1,000 miles away to Indiana, she had felt afraid in her house, like he might suddenly come back. And so she'd actually had Cindy sleep over her house for a while to help her feel safe. And also she asked Roy to literally nail all her windows shut. But despite fortifying her living space, what Susan couldn't escape from were all these awful little notes that Michael had left behind and hidden all over the house. All these awful messages, just basically telling Susan all these terrible things about her and how much he hated her. She kept finding them all the time. But as of right now, the house was neat and tidy, and Susan by this point believed she had found, almost every note, or certainly close to every note. So, to celebrate, Susan headed over to the couch and sat down and turned on the TV. Her plan was just to watch a couple of shows and just enjoy the peace and quiet, and then go to bed, because tomorrow she would have to get up early for work. As she was sitting there, flipping through the channels trying to figure out what she wanted to watch, she heard a knock on the front door. Two days later, at 6 p.m. on the afternoon of July 28th, Susan's father, Joe Atkins, was at home when his phone rang. And when he picked it up, it was Susan's manager at the sandpaper factory, which was weird. The manager told him that he was calling because Susan had not shown up to work for the past 2 days, and nobody could get a hold of her. And so he was wondering if Joe knew where she was. Joe frowned and said no, he didn't know, but he would go find out. He hung up and he immediately dialed Susan's number. And when she didn't answer, he didn't think twice. He just put the phone down, grabbed his keys, hurried out to his truck, and started driving towards Susan's place. A half an hour later, Joe pulled up outside of Susan's house, and he went up to her front door. And when he knocked, nobody answered. But he could hear the TV on inside. And when he tried the doorknob, he found the door was unlocked. He opened the door up a little bit, and he poked his head inside, and he called his daughter's name. But he didn't get a response. So he stepped all the way inside. The house was basically clean, except there were snacks out on the coffee table, and the TV was still on, and it was on pretty loud. But also, there were some cigarettes that had been burned out in an ashtray on the coffee table, and Joe knew his daughter didn't smoke. And so at this point, everything told him something is wrong. So Joe walked through the living room and into his daughter's bedroom. And his daughter was not in there, But the bed was a mess. The sheets and the bedding had all been ripped off and were sitting in a heap on the floor, and the mattress itself was hanging off the box spring. Joe was about to leave and search the rest of the house when he noticed the bathroom door in the bedroom was open. Joe forced himself to step toward the door, and as he did, his heart began to hammer in his chest. And then, when he leaned around the door and looked inside the bathroom, he just froze. For what felt like a very long time, but was very likely only a few seconds, Joe didn't move or breathe. Then, it's like he broke out of his fog, he stumbled backwards, he ran to the living room, grabbed the phone, and he called 911. Sergeant Donnie Hensley of the Stephenville Police Department had just gotten home after a pretty long shift when he got a call from dispatch to head back out again. A homicide had just been called in, and every available officer had to head to the scene right away. The dispatcher did not have many details, but they did know that the victim was a young woman and that she had been found by her father inside of her home. When Hensley got to the address, he found there was an ambulance there and a couple of fire trucks and police cars and a whole bunch of police officers that were already out and about stringing up crime scene tape. But he also saw someone that he was not expecting to see. It was a friend of his, a guy he knew who volunteered at the town's golf course. His name was Joe Atkins. So he walked over and he asked Joe, hey, what are you doing here? But the instant he asked that question, and when Joe turned around to look at him, Hensley understood why he was here. He suddenly remembered that Joe had a daughter, and based on the look on Joe's face, clearly his daughter was the murder victim. Joe had found her. Hensley was a hardened detective who had been to plenty of crime scenes by this point, and he had seen some terrible things. But the pure grief on his friend's face was too much for him to bear. He knew there was nothing he could do to take Joe's pain away. So instead, without saying anything, Hensley took Joe's hands, and the two men just stood there and prayed. And then after a few minutes, he let go of Joe's hands, and then he turned and walked up Susan's front steps to begin the search for her killer. The crime scene unit was already inside of Susan's home, hard at work, by the time Detective Hensley walked through the front door. A supervisor walked over and brought Hensley up to speed. They told him that Susan's body was in the bathroom, and from the looks of it, she'd been dead for a while. The front door had been unlocked, and there was no sign of forced entry, which suggested that Susan may have let her killer inside. Detectives were now dividing up the house into quadrants to examine each part of the crime scene, and Hensley would be working primarily in the bedroom. But the supervisor warned Hensley that the crime itself was incredibly brutal, likely bordering on torture, and he should just mentally prepare himself. Hensley nodded, and for a moment he just stood there and collected himself and took stock of the scene. He looked over at the coffee table in the living room, and he saw it was covered with snacks, including a bag of potato chips, a pack of Twinkies, and an open Coke can. And there was an ashtray with 6 cigarette butts inside of it. It looked like more food and more cigarettes than one person would reasonably consume, and so maybe Susan had had company. But otherwise, the house was clean and pretty unremarkable. Except for one thing that took Hensley a minute to notice. And what it was is all the windows were nailed shut from the inside. Susan clearly must have been scared of somebody breaking in. And so naturally, Hensley wondered if maybe the person she was scared of breaking in was the same person who wound up killing her. But if that was the case, why had she apparently opened the door for this person? At this point, Hensley moved into the bedroom. And as soon as he did, he could tell there had to have been a struggle in here. Because the mattress was hanging off the box spring, the sheets had been pulled off, and they were heaped up on the floor. And there were all these scuff marks on the floor that suggested the bed very likely had been moved, dragged around inside of the room. There was also a white extension cord lying on the mattress, and also there was this pillow that had all these strange black smudges on it. Hensley walked over and looked at this pillowcase, trying to figure out what the smudges could be, and then he realized it was mascara. The pillow must have been held over Susan's face to suffocate her. But when Hensley walked into the bathroom and saw what was in there, despite the warning he was given about how brutal it was, he still was taken aback and found himself gasping. Susan's body was draped over the side of the tub, with her head still in the water. At first glance, it was obvious Susan was dead, because her head and shoulders that were underwater were severely decomposed from being in the water. And so at this point, Hensley realized that whoever murdered Susan had likely sexually assaulted her, strangled her, smothered her, and then held her body underwater. I mean, this had been a savage attack committed by a monster. However, Hensley also realized that this monster, whoever had done this, had made at least one mistake, because one of the crime scene techs that was in the bathroom was pointing at the tub with excitement. And when Hensley looked at what they were pointing at, you could see perfectly clearly there was a set of palm prints, almost certainly left behind by the killer. The following morning at around 10 a.m., Sergeant Hensley walked into the Stephenville police station and promptly filled up a paper cup from the bullpen water cooler and drank it down. It was over 90 degrees outside, and he had just spent all morning and a lot of the previous night canvassing the neighborhood where Susan had been murdered. But despite all their efforts, they really hadn't gotten much. Susan had been found on Tuesday, but nobody had reported seeing her on Tuesday or the Monday before or the Sunday before, which left a window of 3 days for this murder to have taken place. One of Susan's neighbors did remember seeing a, quote, large-framed man park his truck near Susan's house on Sunday night, but that described a lot of the men in Stephenville, so that didn't really narrow anything down. Now, the police chief had not yet assigned a lead investigator to Susan's case, but because Sergeant Hensley knew Susan's father personally, he was hoping to stay involved. So after drinking a second cup full of water, Hensley headed down the hall to the chief's office, where he asked to see Susan's autopsy report. The chief's secretary handed it over, and Hensley quickly began to thumb through the pages. But he quickly realized there really was almost nothing here that he didn't already know. The report confirmed that Susan had been sexually assaulted, but her body was so decomposed, it was impossible to determine exactly how or when she had died, although the coroner estimated she'd been in the tub for roughly 2 days. But right at that moment, another investigator named Lieutenant Ken Maltby walked up and grabbed the report right out of Hensley's hands. And before Hensley could protest, Maltby walked back to the bullpen and rapped his knuckles on a door frame to get everybody's attention. Then Maltby announced that he would be taking over Susan's case, so everybody else, Hensley included, should back off. And Hensley did not like this, not only because, he had this closeness with Susan's father, but also because he had a feeling that Maltby was only interested in this case because he thought it would help his career. However, Maltby outranked Hensley, and Hensley already had a full caseload of work, so there really was very little he could do here. So, with a resigned sigh, he headed back to his desk. Two days later, around 2 p.m. on July 31st, Sergeant Hensley stood in the back of a small crowd, sweating through his suit, as Susan's casket was lowered into the ground. Hensley was at this funeral really to support Susan's father, Joe, because he was not really a part of the investigation. However, he couldn't help, scanning the mourners, through a detective's lens to see if anybody seemed suspicious. There was a group of people in their 20s and 30s that were standing towards the front, and Hensley assumed they must be Susan's friends. He remembered what one of Susan's neighbors had said about a large-framed man, and he looked at all the men, taking note of their size. At the center of the group, there was a blonde woman who was sobbing, and Hensley recognized her as Susan's best friend, Cindy Hallmark, who was leaning on her boyfriend, Roy Hayes. The two of them had actually come to the crime scene by coincidence on the day Susan's body was found, and they had totally broken down when they realized what had happened. But now, Hensley was suddenly noticing just how physically enormous Roy was. And so in that moment, Hensley thought to himself, if he was in charge of this case, he knew Roy would be somebody he'd take a close look at. But that was not his decision. But then Hensley noticed that there was actually one person who was conspicuously absent from this funeral, and that was Susan's ex-husband, Michael Woods. From what Hensley had heard around the station, nearly all of Susan's friends and family were convinced that it was Michael who was the killer. But there was a problem with this theory. Michael lived 1,000 miles away in Indianapolis, and word around the police station was that during that window of time where Susan was murdered over those 3 days, Michael was in Indianapolis, and he was around loads of people who would vouch for him being in Indianapolis, which meant that, as far as Hensley knew, there really was no way for Michael to be the killer. And so Hensley just hoped that Lieutenant Maltby had another, better suspect in mind. For the next few weeks, Sergeant Hensley focused on his own cases, while still keeping tabs on Susan's. Every couple of days, her dad would call him up and ask why Michael hadn't been arrested yet, and Hensley would always tell him that the case was in good hands and they're working on it. But as the weeks passed by with no arrests, Hensley started to wonder, what was going on here? Something needs to happen. Why is nothing happening? Then one day in early October, so roughly 2 months after Susan's murder, Hensley walked into the bullpen to find Maltby celebrating. Not because of any progress in the case, though, but to celebrate his big promotion. Maltby was going to be the lead of a new narcotics unit, and his open cases that he had been working on were just going to be, given to other investigators or filed away altogether. And so as Maltby accepted congratulations from other officers and just made a whole scene, all Sergeant Hensley could think was, well, what's going to happen to Susan's case? It could easily fall through the cracks here. And so without even talking to Maltby, Hensley walked straight to the chief's office and asked to take the case over. The chief shrugged and just said, sure, you're welcome to try, so long as this case does not get in the way of his other work. Hensley agreed and then went to get Susan's file, and then after he had it in hand, he hurried back to his desk and began rifling through the pages. And he was stunned to find that there was almost nothing in there besides the original autopsy report. And that's when Hensley remembered that Lieutenant Maltby claimed to have this photographic memory, and so he almost never took notes. And so Hensley was basically going to have to start all over from square one. At 9 a.m. the next morning, Sergeant Hensley sat down in the kitchen of Susan's best friend, Cindy Hallmark, as Cindy poured them both a cup of coffee, and then Cindy started talking. And she had a lot to say. She was absolutely convinced that Susan's ex-husband, Michael Woods, was the killer, and she just could not understand why it was taking detectives so long to arrest him. Cindy said, for most of Susan and Michael's relationship, Michael was just kind of a loser. He couldn't keep a job, and he'd just lift weights and play guitars shirtless in the front yard. However, when they had broken up, Michael had recorded this totally unhinged audio recording about how awful Susan was and left it for Susan, along with all these notes he had hid all around the house and the property, which also just said terrible things about Susan. And this behavior by Michael had scared Susan so much that she had asked Cindy and Cindy's boyfriend Roy to help nail all her windows shut, specifically to prevent Michael from coming into the house. Hensley listened and wrote everything Cindy said down, but he really wasn't as sold on the Michael Woods theory as everybody else in Stephenville seemed to be. And that was primarily because the police in Indianapolis had spoken to Michael, and apparently he had given them a rock-solid alibi. And so realistically, it didn't make sense for him to be the killer. That said, Hensley was pretty confident that the killer had to be somebody Susan knew. The lack of forced entry, coupled with all the snacks and the Coke can and cigarettes on her coffee table, suggested that Susan might have entertained her murderer before they killed her. And so at this point, Hensley was much more interested in learning if there were other romantic interests in Susan's life, besides Michael. And when he asked Cindy that question, she said, yeah, there was one other guy. She said right before Susan was killed, she was seeing this bartender named J.C. Bauman. However, they'd only gone on a few dates. Cindy said that J.C. had put a lot of pressure on Susan to sleep with him, and so she had just broken up with him. And when Hensley heard this, he felt like this was really promising. And so when Cindy finished telling her J.C. story, he asked her if she knew where he could find J.C. And she said yeah, and she gave him the address of the bar where he worked. 45 minutes later, Sergeant Hensley pulled up in front of the bar. It was still too early for business, but there was a delivery truck out front, and there were a few men who were unloading kegs and bringing them inside. And so Hensley walked up to these guys, and he asked if any of them knew a J.C. Bauman. And this tall, bearded man raised his hand and said, actually, that was him. A few minutes later, Hensley and J.C. were sitting at the empty bar. Hensley watched J.C.'s face very closely as he explained to him that he was here to talk about Susan. J.C. nodded and ran his fingers through his hair like he was nervous. And then he said his throat was dry and asked Sergeant Hensley if he wanted something to drink. Sergeant Hensley said he was okay, but JC, he got up, went behind the bar, and then came back with a can of Coke. And after sitting down and opening the drink up and taking a sip, JC also lit up a cigarette. And so immediately, Hensley thought of the Coke can that was on Susan's coffee table, as well as the ashtray full of cigarettes, despite the fact that Susan was not a smoker. And so the interview had barely even started, and Hensley was already very suspicious of JC. So he decided to push pretty early and see how JC reacted under some serious pressure. And so right out the gate, he asked JC where he was on Sunday, July 26th, which was the day investigators at this point believed Susan was murdered, based primarily on the autopsy report. And when JC was asked that, he swallowed and said he couldn't remember, which was possible. I mean, the murder happened 2 months earlier, but it didn't make JC look that good. So Hensley asked JC if it was true that he and Susan broke up ultimately because he, JC, had pressured her for sex. JC turned beet red and said he had never pressured Susan. He said they had been intimate, but just once in Susan's bathtub. And when Hensley heard this, he nearly dropped his pen. It seemed extremely suspicious that JC was claiming to have been intimate with Susan in the same bathtub where she was found dead. And so Hensley wondered if he was maybe trying to get ahead of the fact that his fingerprints would be found on or in that bathtub. Now, legally, Hensley knew he could not compel JC to offer up his fingerprints without charging him first. But he took a chance and just asked anyway. And to his surprise, JC said, "Yes, you can have my fingerprints." And he almost seemed relieved. He said, "Whatever you need to help solve Susan's murder, I'll do it." 2 hours later, Sergeant Hensley was back at his desk in the Stephenville police station looking at a card that had JC's finger and palm prints on it. And as he looked at it, he began thinking about those palm prints on Susan's bathtub. In 1987, fingerprints and palm prints were just much slower to process than they are today. And the closest lab that analyzed these prints was an hour and a half away in Fort Worth. And Hensley knew they were always working with a backlog, so his results could easily take months. But Hensley was not going to just sit around and wait, because he had one more suspect he wanted to talk to. The following afternoon, Sergeant Hensley walked into an interrogation room at the police station and sat down across from Roy Hayes, who was Susan's best friend, Cindy's boyfriend. Hensley wanted to speak to Roy for 2 reasons. One, he matched the physical description of the large man seen near Susan's house around the time of her murder. And 2, there just weren't that many people who were close to Susan. And Roy saw her when she was both with Cindy and also when she would attend those members of the Round Table get-togethers. Now, that was not that incriminating, but Hensley knew that catching the killer was as much about ruling suspects out as it was about ruling them in. So that was really all he was trying to do here with Roy, is just maybe find a way to say, nope, not him. But before Hensley could even begin asking Roy questions, Roy just started talking. He told Hensley that he had been thinking about Susan's case nonstop. He said that his mind had been running wild with all the possible ways the killer could have gotten inside. And so now Roy was eager to share his theories. After all, he said he was the one who nailed those windows shut, so he knew where the weaknesses in her house were. And so Hensley said, "Okay, let's hear your theories." And Roy began listing all the ways a person might be able to get inside of Susan's house, including what Roy said was the most promising, which was a 6-inch crack in the window above the kitchen sink. And as Roy did this, all of a sudden, he was at the top of Hensley's suspect list. And when Roy was done rattling off all the ways he would break into Susan's house, Hensley asked him, "Where were you on the evening of Sunday, July 26th? And Hensley watched as Roy's expression changed from very intense to surprised, as he realized he was now being asked for his own alibi. Roy started stumbling over another very long, rambly answer, and what he had to say ultimately just made him look even more guilty. Because Roy told Hensley that on the night Susan was killed, he had been over at a friend's house playing a game called Dungeons and Dragons. So today, people know Dungeons and Dragons as a harmless fantasy role-playing game. But at this time in 1987, it was viewed very differently. In the late 1980s in America, there was this huge fear that certain games, books, and heavy metal songs were all linked to devil worship. The TV news ran regular stories across the country about how Dungeons & Dragons specifically encouraged players to cast spells and practice witchcraft. And the local paper in Stephenville had carried a full-page ad calling the game satanic. So when Roy told Hensley he had been playing Dungeons & Dragons on the night Susan was killed, Hensley immediately thought back to the horrible brutality of the crime scene. And he wondered if maybe Susan's murder could have been tied to some kind of dark ritual. And so Hensley looks at Roy and says, "Okay, well, are you prepared to give us your fingerprints?" And Roy said, "Yeah." A half an hour later, a very disappointed Sergeant Hensley watched Roy walk away from the station. Just like with JC, Roy had seemed incredibly suspicious at the start of the interview, but then he'd easily offered up his fingerprints like he wasn't concerned at all about whether they'd matched the killers. So Hensley was not sure what to expect in terms of results here. But he still sent Roy's prints off to the outside lab to be added to the queue behind JC's. Hensley was contemplating his next move when the station receptionist walked over and said that someone from the Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department was on the line for him. They were following up on the inquiry he had made a few days earlier to double-check the alibi of Susan's ex-husband, Michael Woods. Hensley eagerly ran to the phone, and when he heard what the officer had to say, he practically jumped out of his chair. Because according to the Indianapolis police officer, it was true that Michael said he had an alibi with lots of witnesses, but he had promised to provide the names and contact information for all those witnesses, and he had never done it. Which meant Michael's alibi, the same one Stephenville police used to rule him out as a suspect, or more specifically, they used the idea of his alibi, the belief that his alibi existed, that's what they used to rule him out. Well, clearly, it was totally unverified. Lieutenant Ken Maltby, who was in charge of the case when this decision was made, had just completely dropped the ball. Somebody had to check Michael's alibi. On a bright morning in April of 1988, Sergeant Hensley walked out of the Indianapolis International Airport with a single duffel bag of luggage slung over his shoulder. He was here to try to collect the fingerprints of Susan's ex-husband, Michael Woods, who was now Hensley's primary suspect. Hensley had been trying to coordinate the investigation into Michael from Stephenville, Texas, but it had proven to be kind of cumbersome, and so he decided to just take matters into his own hands and actually go to Indianapolis. He knew Michael did not have to submit to fingerprinting unless he was charged with a crime, so Hensley had come up with a plan. He was going to put Michael under surveillance and wait for him to do something illegal. Maybe he gets into a fight or an altercation, or he buys some marijuana, or even jaywalked, anything. Hensley would use it as an excuse to arrest him and get his prints. For days, Hensley sat in an unmarked van outside the house where Michael lived, watching the front door through a telephoto camera lens. But Michael and his roommates seemed pretty boring. They barely even left the house. Hensley was beginning to think that his big plan to catch Michael doing something illegal was a huge waste of time. It just was not going to happen. But then one morning, he noticed some unusual activity in Michael's front yard. Michael and his roommates were laying out furniture and clothing on their front lawn, clearly getting ready for a yard sale. Sergeant Hensley was snapping photos of everything they were bringing out, and at one point, he saw something that gave him a rush of excitement. Because through his lens, he spotted these crystal figurines that appeared to be the exact same type of crystal figurines that Michael had allegedly stolen from Susan's house in Stephenville when their marriage had ended and he had left to go to Indianapolis. Hensley practically laughed out loud. I mean, this was too easy. This was his chance. So he called the local police, and they stormed the yard sale, and they arrested Michael for theft. 2 weeks later, now back in Stephenville, Sergeant Hensley walked into the police station to start a shift, and he found a manila envelope waiting for him. It had a return address that said it was from the Texas DPS Crime Lab in Fort Worth, Texas, where he had sent all of the suspects' fingerprints. Hensley ripped open the envelope and dumped the contents onto the table, and as he began looking through them, he realized the lab had already analyzed all 3 sets of prints that he had sent in. They were Susan's ex-boyfriend, J.C. Bauman, her best friend's boyfriend, Roy Hayes, and her ex-husband, Michael Woods. Now, at this point, if Hensley had had to guess who the killer was, he would have guessed Michael, because Michael is this estranged ex-husband who had left behind these terrible recordings and notes, and he had spooked Susan so badly at the end of their relationship, she had nailed her windows shut to keep him out. And then also, his alibi was sort of up in the air. They didn't really know if he had one or not. They hadn't been able to actually verify it or not yet. JC also had basically no alibi. He drank Coke and he smoked cigarettes, just like the killer had left in Susan's living room, or is believed to have been the killer who left those behind. And Roy, in virtue of playing Dungeons and Dragons, could potentially be involved in Satanism. And also he seemed way too eager to talk about how he might break into Susan's house. However, for Hensley, he felt like one of these three men is the killer. He's about to get his answer. But as he read through each of these reports, he went from exhilaration to confusion, and finally just total disbelief, because none of these prints that he'd submitted matched the ones from Susan's tub. Hensley wanted so badly to solve this case, to give Susan's father Joe, his friend, some closure. But now, he felt like he was totally out of ideas. Susan's case ultimately went completely cold. Sergeant Hensley retired, and 19 years passed by. And then one day, in early 2006, Lieutenant Don Miller of the Stephenville Police Department took a box labeled Susan Woods down from a shelf in evidence storage, carried it back to his office, sat down at his desk, and began to look through its contents. Miller had recently been tasked with reviewing the department's unsolved cases, including Susan's. He read all of Sergeant Hensley's notes, he studied the crime scene photos, and he reviewed all the witness statements. None of it looked very promising. In fact, it looked like all the suspects had basically been ruled out. But then he saw those palm prints that had been lifted from Susan's bathtub, which had never been matched to anyone, and he had an idea. Back in 1987, there had been no centralized database of fingerprints. This meant that unless you had a specific suspect to compare an unknown prints against, the unknown print was effectively useless. And that's really what had happened in Susan's case. None of the suspects had matched this unknown print, so the case was put on a shelf. But in 2006, the FBI now had a national database of all the fingerprints of everybody in America who had ever been arrested and fingerprinted. And this meant that if Susan's killer had ever been arrested for any crime anywhere, their fingerprints would likely be in that database. Now, Lieutenant Miller did not have the budget or the time for a full-blown reinvestigation here, but he certainly had the time and money to just submit those prints into this FBI database to just see if there was a hit. So he submitted them and then put her case file back in storage. And sure enough, a few days later, Miller was at his desk when his phone rang, and it was the FBI, and they told him they had found a match. But when the FBI agent told Miller the name of the person whose prints these matched, it meant nothing to Miller. He didn't think he'd actually even heard the name before, and the person had been arrested for robbery in Nevada, not Texas. Miller thanked the agent, and he quickly began digging through this person's history, and he also went and got the Susan Woods case file. And slowly but surely, it all began to come together. And as Miller read through in her file all the names of the people that Susan spent her time with, he noticed something. And finally, it all just clicked. Lieutenant Miller had found the killer. Based on evidence collected at the crime scene and the killer's written confession, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Susan Woods on the evening of Sunday, July 26, 1987. Stephenville's Main Street was busy as the killer drove through town in their brown pickup, sipping a mixture of soda, vodka, and cough syrup. They stared out their window at all the happy people in the restaurants and the storefronts, and as they stared at these people, a darkness stirred inside the killer. This darkness had been there for years, telling the killer they were no good and they would never be close to anyone. Alcohol was the only thing that seemed to make this darkness go away. so the killer stayed half drunk most of the time. But sometimes even the alcohol wasn't enough. A few years back, when the TV news had been running non-stop with talk about devil worshipping, the killer had been sort of inspired, and they thought they might try that. And so they had lit a bunch of candles and set them around their room in the shape of a pentagram, and then the killer stripped off their clothes, they stretched out on the floor, and they offered up their soul to the devil in exchange for freedom from this darkness. But unfortunately, the darkness remained. And so now, the killer, feeling very riled up, took another drink and thought of Susan and the way she'd smiled at them the last time they had seen each other. The killer had not had the courage to make a move back then, but now, with this buzz that they had from their drink, they really couldn't see a good reason not to make a pass at Susan. So they turned off the main road and they drove the short distance to Susan's house. In a matter of minutes, the killer was at her door, knocking. Susan opened the door and surprise flashed across her face, but then it softened into a smile and she told them to come on in. Susan told them to get comfortable, and as they sat down on the couch, she went to the kitchen to get the killer a Coke and some snacks. Then she brought them back and she sat down on the couch next to the killer to talk and catch up. And that was when the killer made their move. They leaned in to kiss her. But Susan immediately pulled back, suddenly angry. The killer grabbed her, and Susan slapped them across the face. And right then, the killer exploded. It would take almost 20 years, but that single action of the killer placing their hands on the bathtub did eventually give Lieutenant Miller the killer's identity. He was the younger cousin of Susan's best friend, Cindy Hallmark, and he was one of the members of that roundtable group who supported Susan through her divorce. He had also been at Susan's funeral and helped her friends through the aftermath of her death. The killer's name was Scott Hatley, and just a week before he killed her, he had been hanging out with the members of the round table, and Susan was there. And Susan, who was this, very shy, gentle person, had sort of opened up around this group. She was feeling happier and happier, largely because this group of friends, including Scott, had been so supportive. She really felt like she belonged here and was safe here. And during that meeting amongst the members of the round table, just sort of inexplicably, Susan had looked over at Scott and simply smiled at him. And for that reason pretty much alone, Scott, a week later, had shown up on her doorstep and murdered her. By the time Lieutenant Miller put all of this together, Hatley was 41 years old and was still a free man. And so on June 7, 2006, Miller had him arrested and charged him with Susan's murder. He would ultimately take a plea deal and was sentenced to 30 years in prison, but would only serve 11 years before he was released for good behavior. However, 3 years after Hatley got out of prison, he was found dead inside of his RV from cancer complications. And among his things, investigators would find this handwritten diary where he confessed to Susan's murder. The pages were also filled with references to Satan and demons, and Hatley specifically wrote that some kind of outside presence had been responsible for pushing him to ultimately assault and kill Susan. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. So click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.